Have you ever witnessed a dream being torn apart, just by a glance soaked in prejudice? Have you ever seen a child dragged away in silence, as if he were a criminal just because he sat in the wrong seat? And if that person were your child, your younger brother, or your younger self, what would you do? It was a calm morning at Denver International Airport. Inside a lounge reserved exclusively for pilots, a 16-year-old black boy sat quietly, watching a documentary on the history of aviation. He wore a crisp dress shirt, and around his neck hung a freshly printed ID badge from the Horizon Career Experience Program, a selective initiative that only a few outstanding students nationwide were chosen for. His name was Malik Carter. And ever since he was 6 years old, he knew exactly what he wanted to be. A pilot. But just a few minutes later, something no one expected happened. The door to the lounge swung open. A white female pilot stepped in, her eyes full of suspicion. She didn't ask, "Are you okay?" Instead, she said, "Who let you in here?" Moments later, Malik was accused of trespassing. Suspected of being a spy. Security was called to escort him out. He didn't scream. He didn't resist. He didn't talk back. But it was precisely that silence that would shake an entire airline. In today's video, you'll follow with me a true, painful, yet hopeful story about Malik Carter, a boy who dared to dream of flying through skies filled with prejudice. The journey from a cold pilot lounge to the cockpit of a Boeing 787. And how a father, quiet but powerful, helped his son reclaim his dignity and sparked a wave of change across the U.S. aviation system. Do you believe that one person, in the right place at the right time, can change everything? If so, let me take you back to that very morning. The moment it all began. That morning, the sky was clear. The sun was gentle. Inside the pilot's lounge at Denver International Airport, a space typically reserved for those in uniform, with gold stripes on their shoulders, a boy sat quietly in the back left corner. Pinned to his chest was a badge labeled Career Exploration Program, Horizon Airlines. The badge wasn't flashy or prestigious. But to Malik Carter, it was like a boarding pass into the world he had dreamed of his entire childhood. He was only 16. A high school student from Atlanta, Georgia. Black, bright, soft-spoken, and so passionate about aviation, it bordered on obsession. Malik could recognize the sound of any aircraft engine with just a passing hum. He would draw cockpit layouts the way others doodled their study desks. And every night before falling asleep, he would gaze up at the sky, watching the red blinking lights of distant planes, as if seeing himself there, in the cockpit. And now, today, the first day of the career experience program he had worked so hard to get into, Malik had been brought to the pilot lounge to wait for his assigned mentor to return. He sat still, touching nothing, watching a documentary about civil aviation with full attention. To him, everything in that room was magical. Full of wonder. Full of purpose. Until the door swung open. A white female pilot entered, tall, dressed in a flight blazer, golden 4-bar epaulets gleaming on her shoulders. Her eyes scanned the room, then landed on Malik. No greeting. No warmth. Only a cold question. "What are you doing here?" Malik flinched slightly. But he remained calm. He stood up and offered a small, polite smile. "I'm a student in the Horizon program. Ms. Tanya from HR just brought me here and said I could wait. He hadn't even finished his sentence when the pilot, her name was Captain Karen Aldridge, stepped forward, yanked the badge from around his neck, her gaze sharp and accusatory. "This badge is fake. You're not authorized to be in this area. This is a security violation." And just like that, a child, holding onto an innocent dream, was turned into a security threat. Not because he had done anything wrong, but because he didn't look like the kind of person who usually belonged there. When the security team entered, they didn't ask Malik a single question. He was ordered to stand, hand over his phone, and prepare to be escorted out for further questioning. Some people nearby began whispering. Others glanced at him, trying to figure out if something really was off. To them, it may have been procedure. But to Malik, it was the first blow to a dream he had cradled since he was a little boy. Why would a student in a prestigious program be doubted, only minutes after entering the room? Why was the ID badge ripped from his neck, instead of being scanned or verified? This wasn't just a mistake. It was a silent, brutal bias. The kind that still thrives in spaces we like to believe are professional and fair. Sometimes, a single prejudiced look is enough to kill a dream before it ever takes flight. You don't need to shout or insult someone to make them feel unwelcome. Sometimes, suspicion in the wrong place, a cold tone without listening, is enough to turn a special day into a nightmare. And as Malik stood there, surrounded by skeptical eyes, another uniformed figure began walking toward him. Not to defend him, but to judge him. If you've ever walked past a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," you might know the feeling of hesitation. As if the space beyond wasn't meant for you. For Captain Karen Aldridge, that instinct went even further. She didn't just protect the boundary of that space. She believed she had the right to decide who was worthy of crossing it, and who wasn't. In her mind, Malik didn't look like someone qualified to be in a pilot's lounge. No uniform. Unfamiliar face. And most importantly, he didn't belong. Karen believed that her gut feeling alone was enough to act. No need to check the ID. No need to call HR for confirmation. No need to listen to the boy trembling in front of her. Just a hunch, armed with seniority, was enough to summon security, question, and treat a high school student as a potential threat. This story isn't rare. It repeats. Not just in airports. An Asian American student asked to leave class because she looked like she might cheat on the test. A young black man held up in a supermarket for no reason other than the color of his skin. Nurses, engineers, teachers subjected to extra scrutiny or distrust simply because they didn't match the silent default image of who holds power in society. Karen probably didn't think she was a bad person. Maybe she truly believed she was doing the right thing for safety. But when power isn't paired with introspection, it easily becomes a weapon. Not everyone in power is right. And not everyone acting by procedure is serving justice. Some biases aren't written into law. They live in the eyes. In the tone of voice. In how we cut someone off mid-sentence without listening. And if no one speaks up, that power wrapped in the name of duty will continue to trample the silent. Just like how Karen with golden stripes on her shoulders did to Malik. But the scariest part wasn't her authority. It was the crowd around them. The ones who saw injustice and said nothing. There's a kind of noise you don't hear. It doesn't come from alarms, or the loud stomp of security boots in the hallway. It comes from those standing closest, who say absolutely nothing. When Malik was accused, when his badge was ripped off, when Captain Karen's baseless accusations echoed through the lounge, no one spoke up. A pilot in the distance put his coffee cup down, glanced at Malik for a second, then looked back at his phone. A flight attendant walked by, paused briefly, then picked up her pace, as if hoping not to get involved. Even the security officers who could have asked for verification before intervening simply followed Karen's lead, as if the facts were already settled. And just like that, a 16-year-old boy was publicly humiliated with the silent approval of an entire room. Not with force, but with indifference. And that's what hurts most. Not because Captain Karen was so intimidating that no one dared to challenge her, but because everyone believed, this isn't my problem. In social psychology, this is called the bystander effect. The more people who witness something wrong, the less likely anyone is to help. Each person thinks, someone else will speak up. and in the end, no one does. Malik stood there alone. Innocent. Peaceful. And yet treated like a danger. And not a single person said, "Wait. Let's hear what he has to say." And that's why silence can also be an accomplice. The silence in that lounge, filled with uniforms, badges, and people who once swore to protect the truth, was the most damaging thing to a boy still trying to believe in the world. You don't need to shout to fight injustice. Sometimes, you just need to stand next to the one being hurt and say, "I believe you." One sentence, one look, one small act can become an umbrella in the storm of prejudice. And thankfully, while the room agreed with the accusation through its silence, someone was on their way, breaking that silence with every determined step. Someone who didn't stand back, who didn't stay quiet, who didn't wait for others to act. That person was Malik's father, and he was about to walk in when the door to the pilot lounge opened again. This time there were no loud commands, no accusations, only a middle-aged man stepping in. Upright posture, steady gaze, a perfectly pressed gray suit, and a badge pinned to his chest from the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA. His name was Andre Carter. And he was Malik's father. No one in the room knew who the man was. But the moment they saw the way he looked at his son, they could feel, unmistakably, this wasn't just a father. This was a guide. A living symbol of the very dream Malik had been holding onto since he was a boy. Andre didn't grow up with privilege. He was once a poor black kid living near Dulles Airport, walking miles every day just to stand and watch planes fly overhead. He worked part-time at a car wash, saving every cent to buy cheap plastic Boeing models. And he studied relentlessly, eventually breaking into aviation, becoming one of the few black Americans to hold a senior leadership role within the FAA. To him, the sky wasn't a limit. It was proof that human beings can rise, regardless of where they come from or what color their skin is. Malik grew up in that shadow. Not the shadow of success, but of resilience. Every night, his father told him stories about flight principles, about calm under pressure in a control room, and most of all, about integrity. The kind not found in textbooks, but the kind you carry with you, always. So when Malik was humiliated in front of everyone, Andre didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply walked forward, stood tall, looked directly at the person who had shamed his son, and used his very presence to shatter the bias. Because in rooms where prejudice always seems to win, sometimes all it takes is one person who looks like you, standing in a place you once thought unreachable, to change everything. When a black child sees someone like them flying the plane, they think, maybe I can too. When a Latina girl sees a female pilot greet her in Spanish, she realizes, this isn't just a job for white men. Representation isn't about being in the group photo. It's about holding up a mirror, so someone else can see themselves in it. Andre Carter didn't just show up to clear his son's name. He came to remind the room. Fairness isn't a feeling. It's a principle. And everyone has a place in it. Sometimes, danger doesn't come from the loud places. It comes from the places we assume are safest. Rooms marked staff only. Halls lined with security cameras. People in uniforms and badges, walking through security every day. Malik hadn't stepped into a dark alley. He hadn't broken a single rule. He sat exactly where he was told. Wore the ID badge he was given. Followed every instruction. And still, he was doubted. Accused. Treated like a threat. All because one person in uniform thought, he doesn't look like someone who belongs here. How ironic. A place where safety is supposed to be built on process was overruled by instinct, tainted by bias. The very person responsible for ensuring security was the one causing the deepest harm. And this wasn't a one-off case. In 2019, a black pilot named David Smith was detained for an internal security check, just because he looked unusually tense, even though he was in uniform and about to captain a flight. In 2022, an aviation student of Indian descent was removed from a simulation training because his English accent sounded off. In a major U.S. airlines internal survey, 1 in 4 employees of color reported being suspiciously questioned in high-security zones, even when fully authorized. Discrimination in so-called safe spaces is the most dangerous, because it's hard to detect, and even harder to challenge. In Malik's case, if his father hadn't walked in, if there hadn't been security footage, who would have believed the word of a 16-year-old black kid? Who would have guessed that the person with pilot stripes was the one abusing her power? Wearing a uniform doesn't guarantee fairness. And just because a place has a safe label, doesn't mean the people in it are safe for you. Trust doesn't come from clothing. It comes from how you use your power to protect others, or to exploit them. And for Captain Karen, someone used to making decisions on behalf of an entire system, even the presence of Malik's father wasn't enough to stop her. What she didn't know was that every move she made was already being recorded. There are moments in life when it feels like the whole world is against you. You're misunderstood. You're humiliated. You're abandoned. And then truth walks in. Not with noise. Not with fanfare. Just the right person at the right time. And everything begins to shift. When Andre Carter, Malik's father, stepped into that tense, suffocating room, none of the people accusing his son knew who he was. They just saw a black man in a suit, calm but firm, placing a hand on the shoulder of his son, who was still being treated as a security threat. But in the very next second, one of the 2 security officers suddenly received a message through his radio. The voice on the other end was clear. We have confirmation from HR the student's badge is real. And the regional director of the FAA is en route to the scene. The room fell into a brief silence. And in that moment, Andre Carter calmly presented his badge. I'm the regional executive director for the Southeastern Division of the Federal Aviation Administration. And this young man is my son. That silence was heavier than any shouting that came before. Captain Karen took a half step back. Her expression shifted from confident to shaken. But she still tried to justify herself. I was only doing my duty to ensure security. Andre didn't need to yell. He didn't need to accuse. His presence alone forced everyone to look directly at the truth they had tried to ignore. No one dared interrupt Malik anymore. No one dared hold onto the badge they once claimed was fake. Then the security footage was played. The images were crystal clear. An HR staff member personally escorting Malik into the lounge, showing him where to sit, handing him the temporary ID with his photo and personnel code. Not a single rule was broken. Every accusation collapsed like a sandcastle under a crashing wave. And that was the turning point. Not just because the truth came to light, but because silence had been broken. And justice, finally, had a voice. Malik, who just moments ago stood trembling before an entire room, now stood beside his father. Head held high. Eyes glowing with renewed belief. Because he now knew. His dream was still alive. Justice doesn't always arrive quickly. But it comes. If someone has the courage to bring it with them. Truth doesn't always speak loudly. But when it arrives, it doesn't need to scream to be heard. But truth doesn't end with clearing one person's name. It carries a bigger purpose. To expose the wrongs that have been buried for far too long. Once the security footage cleared Malik's name, the room hadn't quite returned to normal. The skeptical looks had turned into uneasy glances. Even shame. But Andre Carter, a man with over 20 years in the aviation industry, understood one thing. A mistake can happen in a moment. But if the same mistake keeps happening, it's no longer an accident. It's a system. He gave a subtle nod to one of the FAA staff who had accompanied him. The man opened a tablet, scanned the screen, and began reading in a calm but firm voice. We've reviewed the disciplinary records of Captain Karen Aldridge over the past 3 years. There are 3 formal reports from staff and trainees, all related to racial bias or discriminatory behavior based on background or language. No one in that lounge knew about Karen's past. Not because it wasn't visible, but because no one had ever dared to ask. Karen was experienced, senior, often praised for her discipline and professionalism. But professionalism does not equal fairness. An Arab American trainee had been dropped from her training group under Karen for lacking discipline, despite excellent grades and technical scores. A black flight attendant was reprimanded by Karen for unprofessional conduct, after simply responding to a disrespectful joke. And now Malik. 3 incidents. 3 individuals. 3 opportunities stolen. Just because they were different. And the saddest part? No one had ever been held accountable. Until today. Discrimination doesn't always shout out loud. Sometimes, it whispers through power. And unless someone is brave enough to confront it, it keeps happening. Quietly. Silently. Even in the most respectable of places. As Karen's record was read aloud, some people lowered their heads. Others remained silent. But most importantly, no one defended her anymore. Because now, they couldn't say they didn't know. And for the FAA, for people like Andre Carter, and for children like Malik, this wasn't just a personal victory. It was a turning point towards something bigger. A cleansing, a necessary correction. And from the pain that was brought to light, something unexpected emerged. Like a small light flickering in the darkness. A woman, also a pilot, stepped into Malik's life. Just when he needed it most. Not to rescue him, but to offer a glimmer of hope. That within aviation, there were also people who had once been hurt, and had made it through. Shortly after the truth about Captain Karen was exposed, the atmosphere in the pilot lounge began to quiet down. But amid the stillness, a voice rang out, soft yet strong. Hello, Malik. I'm Nia. Captain Nia Thompson. A woman in full pilot uniform stepped forward. Her posture was grounded. Her eyes, warm and steady. She was one of the first black female pilots at this airline. And someone who had walked a journey very similar to Malik's. Over 20 years ago, Nia had also been the only one in the room. The only one with an African surname. The only one whose father didn't work in aviation. The only one ever asked, "Are you sure you chose the right profession?" She had faced delays in her training schedule. Had been told she lacked composure. Just because she spoke up against a disrespectful male colleague. And she had once, like Malik today, sat alone in a quiet room. Being looked at as someone who didn't belong. But she never gave up. Because she believed, if she stepped back, more people like her would never dare to step forward. Today, Captain Nia didn't come to be a hero. She came to tell Malik, and everyone who had doubted him, that we don't need to look like them to deserve a place here. We just need to be good enough. And strong enough not to break. Nia was more than a pilot. She was a trainer. A writer of flight training manuals. A regular voice in internal policy meetings. At a company seminar, she once said, "Representation isn't about filling a quota. It's about creating a path. A path where others don't have to bleed to belong. A role model isn't someone perfect. It's someone who has fallen, but stood back up, so others can find their way forward." Malik had just gone through a terrible day. But thanks to Captain Nia, he didn't end it in pain. He ended it with hope. She reached out her hand gently and said, "Would you like to see the cockpit of the Boeing 787? I'm about to take off. And I think you deserve to see the place. You'll be standing in someday." Malik looked at his father. Mr. Carter nodded. And for the first time that day, Malik smiled. The image of the two of them. One passing the torch. One beginning to believe in himself again. Walking out of a room once filled with prejudice. Was a quiet but powerful reminder that every healing journey begins with the hand reaching out at the right moment. And in the next part of this story, we'll see. When faith is restored, change doesn't stop at one individual. It spreads and creates waves stronger than ever. Malik's story could have remained just that. A personal experience. A terrible day. A massive misunderstanding. Wrapped up with an apology, and life goes on. But for Andre Carter, and for the FAA, they knew that if things ended with just a sorry, then this kind of day would happen again. To another child. In another room. With another excuse. And so, 1 week after the incident, the FAA officially launched a groundbreaking campaign in civil aviation. Sky without bias. This wasn't a slogan. It was a commitment to systemic change, including redesigning the recruitment process to include training on unconscious bias, organizing open dialogue sessions between leadership and staff to hear unfiltered, real stories, expanding the Horizon Career Exploration Program nationwide, so that students like Malik would have more than just one shot. Malik's story, as a result, began to be told at seminars and summits. He was no longer the misunderstood boy. He became a symbol of belief in justice. When justice is backed by action. And the most special part? Malik is now the youngest ambassador for the Future Aviators United program. Invited to speak at education events, where he shares one simple but powerful message. A child's dream doesn't need a background check. It just needs to be believed in, and protected. When justice is served the right way, it doesn't just heal wounds. It turns those wounds into strength. Strong enough to transform an entire system. The boy who was once forced out of his seat now stands before hundreds of students, sharing his journey. Not with tears, but with a steady voice and a shining gaze. Because Malik understands. Equality isn't just being treated right. It's making sure others never have to suffer what you went through. Malik wasn't the first to walk into a room and be seen as out of place. And he certainly won't be the last. Across America, every single day, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of children just like Malik. A brown-skinned girl at the front of the class, always raising her hand, but never getting called on. An immigrant boy mocked for speaking English with a different accent. An LGBTQ student avoided by peers for simply being different. They all share something in common. They walk through doors with hope, only to be pushed out because they don't match what people are used to seeing. But if Malik's story teaches us anything, it's this. No one should have to prove their worth, just to be treated with respect. Dreams are the most equal thing humans can possess. They don't need passports. They don't need income statements. They don't need the right skin color. Malik once believed that being excellent was enough. Until he realized. Sometimes, excellence isn't enough. if no one stands by your side. But thanks to his father, thanks to brave individuals, Malik wasn't pushed down. He was held up. He stood tall. And today, he stands for the children who still feel unseen. And maybe, you've been a Malik too. Maybe you've been ignored, misjudged, made to feel not good enough, just because someone said so. If that's true, know this: you are not alone. You don't have to wait for someone to save you. You just need to believe. If you stand up, you won't be standing alone. Smooth transition to emotional CTA. And if you've made it this far into the story, maybe something in your heart was touched. If so, let it spread. Share this story if you've ever witnessed or experienced injustice. Leave a comment for yourself, or for someone who's been hurt by prejudice. And don't forget to hit follow so we can keep bringing you more stories of justice. More dreams that deserve to be heard. Because a dream, when believed in and protected, can change not just a life, but an entire generation. Thank you for listening to Malik's story. See you in the next journey, where justice always has wings.